Okay, so now that we've culled our images and renamed them in Breeze Browser, we've gone through that a few times, we've really whittled it down, we've looked through the folder several times, we've been ruthless, and we've kept absolutely no more than 10% of what we've shot, ideally closer to 5%. We're ready now to go ahead and process our raw files. And it's nice that we've got all of our images renamed, because we can kind of go through, if it's been a big, big trip, maybe you've gone on a tour or something and you've got, 5 or 6 or 800 photos to go through. You're not gonna open them one at a time, because that'll take forever. But you're not also going to open the whole folder, because it's just too much work to get done in one sitting, and your eyes will just get tired and you'll get frustrated. And so what I usually like to do is I'll go ahead here, I'll just double click on here. Sorry, I've just got to navigate up to my correct folder, Columbia RAW. So you can see we've got everything named here, and I'll often just do something like say, okay, I'm just going to do from A, I'm going to do all the A's and the B's, or something like that. I'll just go ahead and go down to here for now. And then you can open them all up, and what it's going to do is it's going to launch Adobe Camera RAW. That is the program that I've always used to process my raw photos. I think it's got the best combination of performance and interface. So I see no reason not to use Adobe Camera RAW to process your raw files. And you can see some of our familiar buddies here. Now again, I've already gone through and processed these. But you get the idea that it loads all the thumbnails down here on the left side, and we'll get into why it's a good idea to do more than one at a time. Let's just do a quick tour of Adobe Camera RAW, just in case you're not familiar with it. So we've got our thumbnails over here. These are all the files we just opened. Of course, we've got the main view here. Down below here, we can see our color space, which you should have being RGB 1998. 16-bit is good, and then it's just showing you the size of the file. So if you've applied any kind of crop or anything, you'll see that shrink down. It shows us how many files we have open right now, 76. That's probably a good number to shoot for a sitting, like 50 to 100 images to sit down. And then, you know what, take a break, go get a coffee or a tea or do something else for a while, and come back and do the next batch. It usually takes me several days to get through a trip's raw photos. I just find I just can't look at photo after photo, hundreds of images. By the end of it, I'm making bad decisions, and it's better to take your time a little bit with this stage of the processing. Now, the main part of Adobe Camera RAW that we're interested in is going to be all over here on the right side. We've got several different toolboxes up here, and we've got this is our main window here. This is our basic controls. This is where we're going to do most of our work. Several of these other boxes we are not going to use at all. I don't use them at all, but I will go through them really quickly here before we come back to the basic where we're going to do most everything. So there is a tone curve adjustment. I typically don't use this, but because I achieve most of that with the main exposure controls. But if you're more comfortable with curves, maybe you're an advanced Photoshop user and you like using curves, by all means, and certain images can benefit from it. So I don't use it. I would say I use it on 1% of my images. The detail is an important consideration. This is where you have your sharpening and your noise reduction. Now, for me, I try to set a preset here that I use for all of my raw images for a given camera. I'm always shooting with the same camera body. When I get a new camera, I update my preset. I don't go in here on an image by image basis and change anything. When I get a new camera, I try to figure out what are the best settings for sharpening and what are the best settings for noise reduction. I just apply those, and then I save my new default in Adobe Camera RAW, and that's my setting. So that's what I would encourage you to do, and I'll show you how to do a raw default here. The HSL grayscale stands for hue, saturation, and luminance. And this is actually an important box, especially on a bird like this cock of the rock here. You can see I've already processed this one, and I toned the brightness of the reds down, and I probably tweaked the saturation too. Many images are going to have one color that sort of stands out from the rest. And if you adjust just globally the saturation or brightness of a color channel, you might have, everything might look great except, in this case, the oranges are way too orange. So I went in here and individually adjusted the reds and oranges. And this can be a really powerful tool in your raw processing. So definitely want to get familiar with the HSL grayscale tab. Remembering that hue is the color tone, saturation is the color intensity, and luminance is the color brightness. So you can use those three things and all the different colors to really tweak the saturation and brightness of the colors in your image. So I wouldn't say that I use that on every image, but what I do is I do my basic processing, and then if something stands out to me, I'll go in and I'll try to tweak it in here. Now we get into a bunch. Split toning, I never use. Lens corrections, I never use because I'm always using telephoto lenses. If you were an a wide-angle architectural photographer, you'd probably use this a lot, but for wildlife photographers, probably not at all. These effects I never use. I just leave this on camera neutral. That's that. And now these are your presets, and we'll get into this in a second, but presets are really important. The reason is, for example here, let's just say we look at these black-backed thornbills here. Here's a perfect example. We've got this image, and then we've got the one down below it. They are basically the same, probably shot seconds from each other, the same lighting characteristics, everything like that. So snapshots are great because what this would allow us to do is, let's say that we had this first image, we had gone through, we had made all the changes that we wanted to, and we knew we wanted to apply these to this image and probably also this image and maybe some of the other ones. It's really easy for us to just come into this little dialog box here and say save settings. It'll ask you then, well, what settings? Okay, well, we want to save them all. And then it'll ask you for a name. And the default is just the file name, which is perfect because we know that we will know which one we want to apply that way. It makes sense, the file name. So there we go, I've just saved the settings, and then all we would have to do is come down to this second image, and we could even select multiple images, so like any of these ones that have this kind of bright orange background here, like these ones. So there's like 5 images we could do all at once. We would just then come over here, and there's our black-backed thornbill. We'd click on that, and it would apply those settings to those 5 images. So then all you'd have to do is apply your crop, and that'd be that. So it's a big time saver saving the settings, and that's why we want to rename our files and have them all together, because it's so much easier to it's a much more batch processing kind of way. You can still check in with each of the images and make sure there wasn't something that you wanted to tweak, but saving the settings and applying them to multiple images is a huge time saver. The other thing that I would really encourage you to do is when you start with Adobe Camera RAW, all of these settings are going to be at 0, and for me, like, I find I almost always tone down the highlights. I almost always add a certain amount of vibrance and saturation, clarity. So what I do is I go through and I kind of try to find a nice average starting point, and then I save that as my new Camera RAW default. And I do that in the same area we saved the settings. You just say save new Camera RAW defaults here. I'm not going to do that because these current settings I don't want to be my defaults. But that way, every time you open an image from your camera body, it'll start there instead of starting at this neutral 0, 0, 0 section. So these are a few time savers you can use. Let's, I'm going to find a file here that we can actually work through. Maybe this guy here. And I'm just going to, I've obviously cropped this image, and I've applied some settings. So I'm just going to get us back to kind of square one on this guy here. I'm just going to that, and now we can see this is my normal starting point here. Exposure at 0 because we don't know how the exposure was, contrast at 0, highlights -5, shadows +2, whites -5, blacks -2, clarity +25, vibrance and saturation both at 15, and the temperature as shot. So where I like to start though is with cropping the image, and we would do that by just coming up here and selecting the crop tool. And then we'd go in, you can see, again, I've already done this for this image, but you just expand the crop box to how you'd like. And if you left click and hold on the crop tool, you can see that you can keep the aspect ratio of your camera. So I usually keep it at 2:3. And that way, it just keeps all of my images consistent. But this is really a personal preference kind of thing. If you want to crop an image square or 4:5 or do something else, you go right ahead. It's your images, you should present them the way you want. This is just my own personal preference. So usually the first thing I do is I crop. And then I just hit the enter button so that it'll zoom into the crop, and now I see, okay, this is what I'm working with. This is the image that I'm going to try to improve with my raw processing. So let's go through this one as if it was, the first time doing it, and then we'll move into Photoshop in part 3 of this video and process the file fully to the final conclusion. So here we've got a nice black-billed mountain toucan. It's probably not the best shot I took of this species, but this is the one we picked. He's got a nice pose here. This vegetation doesn't really bother me. It's got a nice clean background. It's cool. It kind of shows him in his habitat, sort of an interesting pose. Now, what we want to do is work our way through these controls, and Adobe has done a good job of laying them out in a decent order. Sometimes I'll do the exposure first. If I can see, like this image, I can tell I'm obviously going to brighten it up a bit. So I would just go ahead and do that right away. We can do that in a couple of ways. One thing that I really encourage people to do is to click in the box here, and then use the up and down arrows on your keyboard. And the reason for that is if you're using your mouse, what the tendency for most people to do is to actually look at the number, because people think, oh, I don't want to go past 0.5 or whatever. And if you're clicked in there and you're just using the arrows, what you do instead is look at the image. I'm not even looking at the numbers now. I'm just trying to figure out where is an ideal, brightness level to take this guy to. And I just think that that's a really good technique to do with many of these tools, and also once you're in Photoshop. It's not about the number, it's about what the image looks like. If you happen to take a certain image's saturation to 25 and you thought, oh, I don't want to go more than 10, well, too bad. If it looks better, then it's a better adjustment to make. Another cool tool you can use is if you hold down the Alt key, you can see when I click on this slider, you'll be able to see when certain parts of the image start getting overexposed and blown out. So you can see it's really not until I'm way up there that things actually get blown out. That doesn't mean that that's where we would want to take the image. Obviously that's way overexposed, but in certain cases it can be a good tool to see where certain areas of highlights are getting clipped. So keep in mind the Alt or Option key if you're on a Mac, plus clicking on the slider will give you that visibility, and that is also available in Photoshop when you're doing things like levels. So now that we've got our exposure at least basically done here, I'm going to go ahead and tweak the white balance. This to me looks a little bit towards the green end of the spectrum maybe, so I might try to adjust the tint slightly. And again, what I'm doing is I'm clicking in there and I'm just using my up and down arrows. I'm just kind of going up until I feel like it looks too warm, and then backing it off a bit. And then that's sort of how I set my white balance. There is a white balance tool up in the toolbar at the top left here, but I don't find it works very well. If I click that and click in here, it gave me, it's fairly close, but that looks too much towards the magenta. So sometimes you can use that just to give you an idea of a starting point, but typically I go more by sight. This brings up an important point. If you have not calibrated your monitor using a colorimeter and a proper software package, we're kind of sunk before we've even left the harbor, because if your monitor is not accurately calibrated, all of these fine-tuned color settings are not going to help you at all. What you see on your monitor is not what I would see if you sent me the file, and certainly not what your photo lab is going to see. So it's absolutely imperative, if you're getting serious about photography, that you calibrate your monitor. There's a video on my channel here about how to calibrate your monitor, and there's the tools that I use are in my equipment section on my website. There's a variety out there. They're all pretty much the same, but it is absolutely essential that you calibrate your monitor. Okay, so I'm happy with our white balance, happy with our exposure. I'm just going to work our way down through these things and thinking about what these sliders actually mean. Not just sliding aimlessly, trying to make changes. Highlights. Okay, I know that that's affecting the bright areas of the image. So in this case, that would probably be bird's throat here, maybe his rump here, maybe a little bit of this lichen. I don't really see any problems. This is not overexposed, this is fine. I don't see any reason to make them brighter or darker, so I'm just going to leave them as they are. Shadows is going to be more in this area of the histogram here. It's going to be probably his head, his tail, some of this up in here. Again, it looks pretty good. I'm not seeing any big problems here. If anything, I might want to darken the blacks. I'm going to just test that out a bit here, just to see. That'll add a bit of contrast, and it'll kind of deepen some of the shadows underneath the branch and things like that. I think that was a good change. Clarity I'm going to leave as it is. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll just check in with saturation, and I'll pump it up a bit using, again, my arrow keys up. And I'll go up until I start to see one of the, for me, the greens that are in the leaves back here are starting to get a bit too saturated here. Maybe his orange kind of on his back is a little bit too much. So I'm going to back that off a bit. And then what we could do is go into, as we talked about, the HSL tab here. And we could go into the saturation and pull back the yellows and the greens a little bit. So that's going to tone down what we just did there, but it's going to keep the blues and the reds and the rest of the bird looking how we wanted it. So that is pretty much all I do. Work through these basic things. Think about each slider that you're doing. Don't really try to understand what each one means. Again, much further description of what these are and what parts of the histogram they're targeting in my ebook on post-processing. But really work through each one, and you may choose to use HSL if you've kind of encountered a problem with a certain range. Otherwise, that's it. We're ready to process this guy. Now, what I don't encourage you to do is to finish one image and then open it up in Photoshop. It totally kills your flow. What I would do is, for example here, this image that we've just done is very similar to the one below it and the one above it. So probably what we would do, just to reinforce this lesson, is save our settings, save all settings, call it Black-billed Mountain Toucan 04, that's just fine. And then what we could do is select these other two images that are so similar, come up to our presets tab, find it here, Black-billed, where was it? Black-billed Mountain Toucan 04, I think it was, there it is, and select that. And that's going to get us closer to where these ones were. My point is, you've opened up your 76 RAW files here. Don't open these images in Photoshop. Go ahead and process those 76 RAW files as efficiently as possible. You're gonna, speaking of processing them, we're gonna be changing these into either a TIFF file, a PSD, or a DNG. All of these are lossless forms of compression. I convert mine into a TIFF file, and what I do is I just have a folder in my photography section called Images to Process. And so when I save this image, not open, when I save this image, it's just going to go straight in there, and I know that that's one that I then have to take the next steps in Photoshop. That way I can work through in a really efficient way of converting these RAW files, and when I'm done, these 76, or preferably your whole shoot, then you go into Photoshop and start working through those. So if I click on Save Image here, you'll see it asks me where to save it, and just like I said, it's in To Process here. And the file naming, I'm not going to change it. We've already named it, so that's fine. A TIFF is good, that's what we want. But like I said, you could also use a DNG, digital negative, or Photoshop PSD, but we're going to stick with TIFF. And that's it. And we would just hit save. A nice little trick though, if you don't want that dialog box to pop up every time, because you're going to be ripping through these RAW files pretty quickly, is just to hold Alt when you hit Save Image, and it'll automatically, it won't pop up the dialog box, it'll just automatically go in there. So that's a nice little shortcut for you. That's about it for raw processing. Of course, you can develop your techniques. It's really important to develop your eye for processing. So when you see an image pop up, what do you immediately think? Okay, I need to change the white balance, it's too dark, I need to tone down the highlights, and just developing a little bit of a plan. And that will become even more important in Photoshop, where we really start to think about things like, doing selective edits. So far, almost everything we've done has been pretty much global adjustments to the whole image, but Photoshop allows us to do things really selectively. So in part 3 here, we'll get into Photoshop and we'll finish this guy off, polish him up, and we'll look at using some actions to speed us along in there. So stay tuned for part 3 coming up soon.